I'm Martial Dambele. I have the privilege of chairing this session, which is really the signature event of our SIG since 2017. So today we're going to focus on, the conference theme, but with African perspectives. So before we go any further, I would like to turn it over to Mary so that she can do some housekeeping, and then I will come back. So Mary.
So just a couple of things. The presentation itself is being recorded. If all of you can mute your microphones just to cut out any background noise. And we'll encourage you to use the chat box, both in the main session when we're all together as the large group, and also in the breakout rooms for questions or for comments. In both the main room and in the breakout rooms, if you hover over on your taskbar, if you hover over participants, you'll see a yellow, or you'll see a green check mark that says yes. If we can use that as a symbol for hands up, you just click on the yes, your hand will go up, the moderator will note that you have a comment or a question, and then when you're finished asking the question, just click the yes again and your hand will go down. We're encouraging everybody to turn their webcams on when you have a comment or question so we can see each other as we're dialoguing. And remember to unmute your mic and then you mute it back again. Thanks, Martial.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, so I would like to, the next couple of minutes to provide some background on the event. It all started in 2016 at the CIES conference in Vancouver. During our business meeting, we began discussing about ways of sort of enlarging the space and having more time to discuss hot topics or work in progress. And one of our SIG members, Kabakuli, he's from Gambia, and he said, well, why don't we do a Bantaba? And so we asked him what is a Bantaba. He explained what it means, the Gambian word, which stands for Bant, which means tree, and Aba, which is a meeting place. So the word really means a gathering of community members where people discuss salient issues that affect the collective. And then usually it's under a big tree, and then people would discuss at length until they have reached a consensus. This is present in many African societies. So from there, we put in place a small committee that had the task of really developing the concept towards having our first event at CIES 2017. So one of the first things we did is to look for equivalents in other African words. And that's what you saw in the first slide with all the words in the tree. But one of the words that I liked is the word Togu. I asked a friend of mine from Mali if he could find an equivalent. So he came up with Togu, which is really a word from the Dogon culture. And a Togu looks like this. It's a very low ceiling structure where you really have to bend literally to get in. And for the Dogon, this, I would call it a hut, it cannot be higher than 1 meter, 20 centimeters. And the reason is that to avoid angry people to get up suddenly and leave. So if you get up, you'll hit the roof. So the idea is that you have to bend and get in, and you sit and talk until you reach a consensus on the issue that were brought to the community. So we've organized so far 3 events. Starting in 2017, we decided to look at the African Union's Agenda 2063, to unpack it, to problematize and explore new directions for the implementation of this agenda. And as you can see, we had several invited speakers, including me, Ndri Hamidou Bukari from ADEA at that time, Michael Cross from the University of Johannesburg, John Mugo, Lilian Niwagaba. So the concept is to invite people, contributors, to write very short pieces on the theme, and then we do a synthesis, and the synthesis is presented. That's what we'll do today. And then we break out and discuss and come back in a large group. The second was in 2018 in Mexico City on reconstructing North-South relations, where we took post-colonial African perspective on those relationships. And finally, last year, we looked at decolonizing education for sustainability, still from African perspective. So far, we've had 16 different contributors, which to me is a good sign of the vibrancy of this event. And each of them, we have discussants and rapporteurs. Today, you'll meet the rapporteurs for today's event. So this year, in line with the conference theme, Education Beyond the Human, we decided to take African perspectives on that theme. So we asked 3 colleagues to write, again, 3 to 5 page reactions or responses to that theme. So Jose is our first invited contributor, and Leslie Legrange from Stellenbosch University, and Youssef. I'm going to say a few words about each of them so that we know who is around. So Jose is from Mozambique, and he's currently an associate professor in the Graduate School of Education at the American University in Cairo. Interested particularly in issues of power dynamics in education, unveiling issues inherent in the promise of modernity, etc. And one of his publications, key publications, is Power, Politics, and Higher Education, International Regimes, Local Governments, and Educational Autonomy. And in 2012, he received the Joyce Kane Award for Distinguished Research of People of African Descent. That was awarded by CIES. And he's our outgoing chair for the Africa Special Interest Group. Leslie Legrange is a distinguished professor of curriculum studies in the Faculty of Education at Stellenbosch University, as I said, in South Africa. He's a former chair of the Department of Curriculum Studies and also former vice dean for research of the Faculty of Education at the same university. He teaches and researches in the fields of environmental education, research methodology, science, curriculum, and assessment. He has close to 200 publications to his credit, and he also serves on the editorial boards of 7 peer-reviewed journals. And one thing to note also is that in 2015, he was elected as a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology in the UK. And he is a rated social scientist in South Africa and a recipient of several national and awards and prizes, both from South Africa and also from his university. And lastly, but not the least, Youssef Wakhid is a distinguished professor of philosophy of education in the Department of in the Faculty of Education. No, not in the faculty, in the Department of Education Policy Studies at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. where he's been for over 2 decades now. He was also chair and dean of the same faculty. One thing that struck me is that he holds 3 doctorates in philosophy, philosophy of education, education policies, and philosophy. And as a very prolific writer, he has 300 plus research publications, and including 200 journal articles. Finally, in 2014, Youssef received the Education Research in Africa Award for Outstanding Mentor of Educational Researchers. I mean, this is a very prestigious award on the continent that I have the pleasure of working on with Ndri and Hamidou and other colleagues. So these are the 3 colleagues that agreed to respond to a number of questions that you have on the screen. I'm not going to read them, but we wanted them to react to the theme. So Ronesha, Mary, Anne, Mungai, and I prepared a synthesis of what they contributed. And now I'm going to turn it to Mary and Ronesha to share with us the synthesis, where they pull out ideas from these 3 contributions. And this will lead us into the breakout rooms later. So Mary, you have the floor.
So again, as Martial said, I wanted to thank the contributors and thank the synthesis team for putting this together. And together we've created what we call a visual organizer that will just sort of frame where we're going. So trying to put all 3 of the articles together, all the pieces together, and draw out some emerging themes, we broke it down into 3 areas. First, we'll give you a little bit of background on some of the concepts that have come out and the issues arising. And then Ronisha will take you on the possible ways forward. And the last circle is going to be what's done in the breakout rooms, where we provided a couple of guiding questions, and we'll ask you to push forward in thinking together on the implications for education. Just after Ronisha presents the second half of the synthesis, I will pop a file into the chat window that gives you this visual organizer, the notes, and the guided questions. So you'll have that to look over while you're in the breakout rooms. So just trying to clarify a few of the concepts coming out. And then we'll have the invited contributors build on these in their comments after Ronisha and I do the synthesis. So the first emerging concept that intersects all of the papers is this notion of Ubuntu. In Zulu, Marcial and Ronisha, can I leave you with admitting people as they come in? So in Zulu, Ubuntu has been translated into a person is a person unto persons. And Kosa takes this and he changes around the way the word is even written and capitalizes the B in Ubuntu to emphasize and put the emphasis on the Buntu or the Muntu aspect of personhood. Again, in Kosa's interpretation or use of Ubuntu, he sees it as a foundational value system for what he calls planetary conviviality, living together as humans on this earth, and a perception of humanness, which we're going to come back to in just a moment. Wahid takes it a little bit further, and he uses the term Ubuntu to talk about ways of living together, interdependence, especially interdependence with difference. And his notion of cosmopolitan Ubuntu is grounded on 2 elements. The first is that humans, he's writing from the perspective of Africans, but humans should be critically reflexively open to their own indigenous ways of thinking. And the second element is that humans should be reflexively open throughout their life to what is still becoming. And he talks about this notion of the goal, especially of cultivating human relations where caring and dissonance, so both caring and difference, acknowledgement of difference, are important. And he'll talk a little bit more about that. All three of the scholars talk about this notion of humanness and humanism. And it's really important to distinguish between the two of them. Humanness is not humanism, and they say, in fact, it's antithetical. Humanism talks about this notion which privileges, this perception of the world that privileges humans over other species, and both physical and other human beings, and defends the rights of humans, where humanness, as the quote from Ramos talks or presents, is this condition of humans as a continuous process, as a state of becoming, of openness, not of finality. And so therefore, humanness, the concept of humanness, is inextricably bound up with human beings connected to each other and also to other elements in the world beyond the human. Then Lagrange takes it a little further, and he takes a bit of a futurist look on what he calls the post-human predicament. That on one hand talks about humans' interaction and the human-induced changes in the world, both the destruction of the natural environment and also of humans in many ways. And on the other side, the use of technology and science to create, to go beyond what we know of the human. And he talks about these three different senses or scenarios. So the first would be the extinction of our species altogether. The second would be the evolution of a quote, quote, more intelligent human being. Now, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And the third is this idea of humans becoming imperceptible, and this connectedness to all living beings. And again, I'll talk just a bit more in a minute. Lagrange goes a little bit further. Then he pushes us in this second sense, this notion of creation of a more intelligent form of human beings, to look at humans and their entanglement with technology, particularly advancing technologies, where what humans are doing to the earth and to each other. And the term Anthropocene, I was thinking the National Gallery in Ottawa has put together a tremendous exhibit around this epoch of Anthropocene, which again challenges the notion of nature being endlessly malleable, or nature constantly changing, or of human beings and of the changes that will better human beings. So it brings up all kinds of issues of ethics, and issues, the examples, things like AI, genetic engineering, cloning, saving, freezing human bodies, human organs. So again, it connects to Cosa's notion of the colonial modernity box and the notion of the human within the box. So the questions will be for you to discuss in the breakout rooms around resisting or embracing technology if their purpose is to enhance life or other. And then in the third sense, Lagrange goes on and he draws on some of the work of Bray-Body around humans becoming imperceptible. I really like this graphic that Lupinacci puts forward. It's from a 2017 article. And I love the image of shifting from an egotistical worldview to an ecotistical worldview, where you see humans integrated with all other species. In Lagrange's third sense, you would actually see all of these elements as almost spiritual beings, where human beings become imperceptible and all of the entities are interrelated. Then Lagrange goes on and talks about this notion of correctionalism, which I'll ask Leslie to speak to a little bit further, because I don't think I do it justice. But again, drawing from the French philosopher Maya Su, this theory that the idea that according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never either term on its own. And that we know of, and what we know of anything is true only for us, and we can never know because we only ever know things as they appear to us. So again, our perceptions of other human beings, our perceptions of nature, of a tree, of a forest, of land, whether we see it as resource-based or used for mining. So again, it's the conceptions. And the last is just pulling together all three of the articles when we look at issues and challenges moving forward, talk about the issues of modernity and this overarching issue of how do we deal with modernity and Ubuntu. Kosa talks and again reminds us that this modernistic humanizing theory of what is, who counts, who's valued as a human, it's so deeply ingrained that we're even afraid to fathom an alternative, especially as Western academics. He talks about this colonial modernity box with these borders, with a center, with the periphery, but who initiated that box and who controls that box? Who defines humans and who facilitates or prevents the movement of humans inside and outside and across these borders? And that this acceptance of the Western definition of human beings makes us complacent in this process. And for us as academics, the challenge, and all three of these scholars put this out, is do we accept and maintain the status quo, or do we challenge and resist it? So I'll turn it over to Renisha to do I'll stop mine, Renisha, and you'll continue on with the possible ways forward.
Thank you, Mary.
So in terms of us moving forward, the possible ways forward, there's so many great ideas that are out there right now. Kosa, Lagrange, and Wagi all say that we need to first and foremost start by defining what it means to be human. The very meaning of what it means to be human is at the heart of our actions, our behavior. And the Western definition is at the heart of the destructiveness that we've been experiencing. This pandemic is a great example of that right now. So the idea of what it means to be human should be set based on our indigenous understanding, the idea, especially with the term Ubuntu, meaning a person is a person unto persons. I love how Kosa emphasizes that although many interpretations have included the word other, he omits the word other to, he emphasizes the omission of the word other to make sure that we understand we're not in need to other anyone else. And that's something that we need to be mindful of in our ways forward. The terms Cosmo Ubuntu, Zo, and Cosmopolitan Ubuntu, I'll let each of them expand upon those specific meanings, but overall, it all comes down to the idea of identifying that box. That I love how Jose gives us the idea of thinking about a box, and that box being colonialism or the dominant narrative, and the importance of being able to identify what's at the center of that, who's been defining that, identifying the borders and the periphery and the colonialism within it all, because it's important that we first and foremost start by adopting new definitions and understandings, because that is what's going to help us to influence theory, policy, and practice, those three areas, as we continue to align our educational efforts with the Ubuntu framework. And my dissertation is actually using that framework now. We'll see that the interconnectedness of all of that will help us to decenter ourselves as human beings and no longer think that we are the center or the owner of the universe, but better yet, a part of the universe. So that will allow us to decolonize our minds and be mindful of it, and to be self-reflective enough to identify the residue that we continue to carry as we think about the little things that we do, the way that we interact with one another, the way that we think about education. It all comes back to our sense of how we view ourselves as humans, understanding who controls those definitions and making sure that we begin to control them, and think about it in such a way that we define it for ourselves using our own terms, because even the terms that we're still using often tend to possess the residue of colonialism. And so with that, we also, let's see, there's a long list of great possible ways forward, and I want you guys to all think about these. I'm just gonna point out a few of them so we have time to really dig into this in our groups. But definitely making, again, being intentional and making a commitment to liberation and justice that's not defined by the box, but the exterior. And it doesn't mean that we can't use what's in the interior, but just be mindful of when we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, what a part of the baby do we actually keep? And so in that we can recognize our similarities and our differences as possible assets for our mutual benefit, and remain open to new ideas. So I love the idea of considering the role of teacher and student that can sometimes blur, and we'll talk about that when we get to the aspect on education. There we are. So moving on to our next one. So the three ecologies, the self, society, and nature. Again, the idea of when we think about becoming human, what that requires into understanding the community of others. Not the word other as putting people in the periphery, but just knowing that we need to look at how we relate to one another in the cosmos, in the universe, our place as part of the circle, not in the center of it. So again, back to that that image of the egotistical image. We need to focus more on that and learn how to heal. Learn how to heal by not destroying other people, and not to be able to build ourselves up by putting someone else down. When it comes to education, using a post-human Ubuntu framework, it's going to be important that we find the pores within the colonial borders and embrace the possibilities of new understandings that, again, being self-reflexive. As we engage and discuss things with one another, we're all open to each other's ideas, and continue to reserve our judgment without completely being compliant. I know this is difficult for most of us who are in the academy today, but it's important that we continue to be fluid in our process of learning for the sake of enhancing life holistically for everybody involved, and continue to push forward, continue to remain humble, act with an ethical care, enact our humility in our process, but be strong and stand firm in our ability to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, and notice that when other people are being uncomfortable or feel uncomfortable with us pushing forward, that we continue to be resilient in that effort, because this is definitely a struggle, but it must be done. That we need to identify new ways of moving forward, because we cannot continue to act in the way that we have been. So, and what an education would look like from ways forward would be, it must enhance all life. You can't leave anyone out. You have to be considerate, not just human beings, but the rest of the world. As you can see now, we have to consider the earth, and it's beautiful how the earth is actually healing itself while we're all closed down in our homes. But she said nature is not endlessly malleable. You can't use up all the resources without considering how they actually replenish themselves, and understand that we're not working just for today, but for the future of our children and many generations to come. So again, using our own terminology, not being bound by predetermined outcomes. And that's something that we all think about when we have our lesson plans, for example. If it's we're starting from beginning to end, but you are already determining what that child needs to know, versus giving the opportunity for children to identify themselves as being producers of knowledge and not just consumers. And so teaching harmony between humans and nature, of course, and again, utilizing multiple pathways forward with skill development and knowledge acquisition, and that we tend to have everyone build community around that, because everyone's ideas are included. So in our breakout sessions today, we have these questions, and I'll turn it back over to Mary for this part.
Leslie, Jose, and Youssef, this synthesis is what we were able to draw from your contributions. So now we would like to give you a chance to, not to respond, but to fill in some of the blanks that we may have left. We may have missed some parts of what you wanted to convey. So you will each have 7 or 8 minutes to add comments or raise new questions or correct what we didn't understand from your contribution. So we'll go in alphabetical order, starting with Jose, then Leslie, and finally with we end with Youssef. So Jose, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marcial. Thank you, for Mary and Renisha, for doing this really incredible synthesis that I don't think I would have been able to do. Anyway, but the rationale for my work, I mean, you captured a lot of the essential stuff here, and I'll just add maybe 1 or 2 things. And I know the knowledge of the box is one of the central ways of my reasoning around this. And so the rationale of the work was education beyond the human begs the question of what beyond the human means. I mean, that was my first premise, you know. So to take this as a given is to make the ontological assumption that there is such a thing as beyond the human reality, which, you know, then it implies a cosmology of separation between human and the environment where the human lives. So as a way to engage this problematics, then I thought, you know, I proposed this new theorizing, which I call Cosmo-Ubuntu, which is an alternative to the pervasive, dominant, and even hegemonic modernistic humanistic theorizing, which you captured and you talk a little bit about that, and we'll have more discussions on it, hopefully. It's still work in progress. So in the engagement, then I thought, I imagined the box. How do I explain this in simple terms, in terms of an analogy? So I imagine a box, and I invite you or everyone to imagine this box with me, not exempt from having smaller boxes and perhaps even other shapes within, you know, the expansive, diverse space that exists outside the box. The box is what I call modernity. And so in that, you know, becomes important to see. So there's a box and there's also this other exterior space to modernity. And that is a vast world that exists outside of it. So this has more to do with the influence of modernity. It's not a physical box or physical borders or anything like that, but this diverse space outside the box is really what has direct influence to it. So, and then I talk about modernity more in terms of the period, you know, so there may be differences in the way we understand this, but I want you to focus on the fact that this is the period that springs out of the Enlightenment period and establishes itself through humanism. And the fundamental then differences begin when there is this idea of defining the human through, you know, those that particular perspective, which has lingered for so long and has taken on, you know, the different spaces and so on. And I'm not going to go too much into that, but just to say that there's a fundamental differentiation there, in that in humanism, cogito ergo sum is really the motto, is this idea of how, you know, think therefore I am. So thought is very central. Now, the metaphor of the box that I added, that's opposed to what, you know, Renisha did elaborate on the Ubuntu concept, and I think Mary too, you know, personhood, you know, persons are person to persons, you know, so there's no othering, there's no individuation there. So now, you know, after introducing the box, and I thought about this in terms of the exterior space, what about the borders? Because if you have a box that has, you know, exterior space, then there has to be borders. And so who dictates the width of the borders, and who initiates the control of the action that takes place or is allowed at the borders? And so I look at colonialism and how we have learned through, like, the Berlin Conference and the random division of Africa into era and until the point where we are now dealing with borders as regimes. So borders then play a major role in determining who's allowed and who's not allowed into a space. So borders are transitional spaces, I defined it as between the space within the box and the exterior space. That's important in demarcating the box and the exterior space. And then I make the argument that the box is very intentional in maintaining space and territoriality and so on, and using itself as a reference point. So that's one of the central ideas, is this point of the box being a reference point. And again, this is a point that we could, read. Hopefully when this work comes out, we can look at the details. Then the other argument I make is that the box was not designed to, was not designed in any way to shrink, but to propagate the myth that anything happening to it is a catastrophe for the exterior space. Because in its core, the box believes that it has created the exterior space and has teleological control over it. And the box is modernity, remember that. So the box is apocalyptic to anything but itself. It has elevated itself to the status of a god and wound up the clock to time the activities in the universe. So if you think in those terms, you think a whole range of development goals and other global agendas imposed on exterior spaces to achieve within a specific time frame. So while you pause to think about that, you also have to think in terms of sustainable development goals, reflect on the potential colonial debris embedded in the invitation to think of education beyond the human. Okay, this is my problematizing of that particular statement. In a time when the education of the human in the so-called developing world is controlled by the agenda of the box, which has defined the exterior's cosmologies and ecological practices, has defied it, and encouraged and has defied also the encouragement of harmony between humans and nature. So how do you think sustainability, when your cosmology has already been defined and your cosmology has embraced this particular, this harmony between humans and nature, and now you're challenged to think about something that is beyond human. Then I move into the theorizing aspect, because I think this is all fundamentally very rooted to how theories are done. And we need this, so this new theorizing needs to be thinking, it has to be informed by this Cosmo Ubuntu perspective, and it must refrain from modernity agendas. It has to stop being one-sided advocacy and impact ideas. It needs to be careful of, in considering its engagement, particularly with technology and so on. So it has to engage in long-lasting solutions that will not make us accomplices to a new form of colonialism and the historical iterations of the colonial, because we simply joined in and played the game as defined by modernity's offspring. So lastly, the modernistic educational system we inherited continued to serve as vehicles for perpetuating modernity's domination in all social systems, because their theorizing and perpetuation happened during school years. So little kids going to school and learn exactly what we are saying we should begin to unlearn now. So our option is to bring then Cosmo Ubuntu to the current global stage and infuse our inherited wisdom that humans are not only connected to humans, but also to their ancestors, to land, and the overall cosmos. And I end there.
Thanks, Jose.
Thanks very much, Marshall. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this important conversation. And I thought, just like Jose, that Mary and Ronisha, you did an excellent synthesis. So maybe just to add one or two things, and I think there are clear resonances between what Jose has shared. So I think I'll also try and start by asking why this question about beyond the human. And so I think we find ourselves in a particular condition, and some people have called that a post-human condition, and people have given other labels to it. But there certainly is a strong view that we find ourselves in what some have called an epoch, in which humans have come to dominate the planet. Now, there are some like Timothy Morton that says that in a sense that's an odd term, the Anthropocene, because we're also at the point where technology is advancing at such a rapid rate. And there is the possibility that technology itself and its development can be a threat to human life. So I talk about the possibility because of the advancement of technology, as well as because of ecological destruction, that there is actually this possibility that the human species as its animal form could become extinct. So that certainly is one, one possibility. And some have argued that we should think about that and ask questions about how we live, how it is that we going to live, how do we now learn, and how do we talk about the possibility of a world without human beings as an animal species. So, so of course, that looks pessimistic, and others might even say that that is a very ethical thing. If the human species were to become extinct, it might return to becoming, in a sense, part of all of life and what is called Zoe or Zoe. And so there's an ethical and there might be a positive side to that. Then I say that there's another important conversation that's actually going on. And this is a view that technology is advancing at a rapid rate, and it should. And human beings have not evolved at the same pace at which technology is advancing, and will not be able to evolve at the same pace in which technology is advancing. And so our lives will, on an ongoing basis, become entangled and imbricated with technology, and the way we understand the human being in its current, even physical form, will change over time. And there's actually, research projects happening at some of the top universities in the world that's pushing these ideas, mainly in the areas of science and technology. And that is what is called transhumanism. Now, of course, I don't necessarily do it in the paper, but my position is not to support any of those ideas, but to say there's another way of thinking about beyond the human as a critique of humanism, which I think aligns to what Jose has mentioned, and that's where the notion of becoming imperceptible comes into play. And that is about decentering the human, so that the human becomes ecological rather than the egotistical, capital I. So, and that is where I bring Ubuntu into the conversation. Now, I think from what I heard in the synthesis, Jose and both Yusuf were talking importantly about the Ubuntu being part of foundational value systems about conviviality between humans, about interdependence, and so on. But what I try and say is that this interrelationship or relationality between humans should be viewed as a microcosm of relationality to the entire cosmos. So when we think about, so we should think about it as this microcosm, and when one looks at it as a microcosm of relationality in the entire cosmos, then that gets away, it helps us to counteract some of the critiques that Ubuntu is a kind of African humanism, which of course it is not. And then what's also helpful, I think, if one looks at this relationality between human beings, and one looks at that transversally, and there Felix Guattari's work is helpful, because he talks about 3 interlocking dimensions of environment. And the one is the social, and that's relationality and relationality between humans. And then he talks about environment, which is relationality between humans and the more or other than human world. And then he also talks about the self. So his argument is that when you see destruction of the psyche or the self, you will also witness destruction in relationships between humans. And you will also see destruction in terms of humans' impact on the environment. And so I argue that healing can be viewed in the same way. So if you heal relationships between humans, it will transversally lead to healing of the psyche and also to healing of relationships with the more or other than human world. So I know Mary wanted me to say something about correlationism, and that's a huge and complex discussion. So what I think is happening currently is that we have this particular condition in which we find ourselves. It's a predicament. And that's about the threat to life on the planet. It's about what technology can enable us to do to advance life, but also the potential harmful effects of technology, and the way in which we now need to think about what it is to be human and what the reference point for human might be. So I think within this condition, what people are doing is to try and produce academic theories or philosophies to help us to understand this predicament. And we've seen several of these. So you would be familiar with some of the debates around new materialism, which is a feminist interdisciplinary field that has developed. And there are a group of European philosophers who are called speculative realists. And there are a number of them, and Milesu is one of those philosophers. And it's actually a philosophical critique of what he says philosophy has become, starting with Descartes and his cogito. I think, therefore, I am separating the body from the mind and suggesting that the mind is superior, and how that gets tracked through Kant and a host of different philosophers right up to French post-structuralism. So he critiques and says that in these philosophies, what we find is that the objects in the world have been viewed as correlates of the human mind. And so all of these philosophies, with all of its attempts to critique modernity and humanism, has actually remained anthropocentric. And so he has tried to and therefore have become anti-realist and don't actually help us in terms of addressing issues of environmental destruction, etc. And so he tries to make arguments to get out of that and develop sort of new ideas, but it's too complex and take too long for me to get into that. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary and Renisha, for a very apt analysis, analyses, I would say, of our presentations. I thought perhaps I can make 3 points, succinct points, as auxiliary to your analyses. When I look at the African SIG-CIES translation or wording of Ubuntu, it says, Ubuntu ngumuntu ngabanya abantu. There is no preposition that prefixes Abantu. Yet, in our own translations, we say a person is a person unto persons. And previously we have said a person is a person unto other persons. But when I take another critical look at how we have actually translated the SIG-CIES dictum of the Ubuntu expression, I think we might want to revisit our own translation. And perhaps this is my first point. I want to say that the very notion of Abantu already implies humans, persons. But our choice of preposition may be disconcerting. Because if we choose the preposition unto persons, we insert a level of subservience, subjugation into the very dictum of Ubuntu. So if you say that a person unto persons, it can also mean that a person being subjugated to other persons or serving other persons. And that is not what we actually mean. I think it would help us if we rather use the preposition, a person is a person with persons. Because if you use the preposition with, then you immediately eradicate the notion of segregation, discrimination, subordination, or hegemony. You take away the power relations between, in a Foucauldian sense, between a person and persons. So my first comment would be, if we have to rethink the very notion of Ubuntu as a person's relation to persons, it would help us to think of a person with persons rather than a person unto persons. That's my first comment. The second one relates to the very idea of Ubuntu itself. And I really like Jose's notion of a Cosmo Ubuntu, and I'm even prepared to relinquish my term cosmopolitan Ubuntu in favor of his notion of Cosmo Ubuntu, because that is what I actually mean. But what for me is more important than the idea of a Cosmo Ubuntu is the notion that, like any educational concept, because that is how I understand Ubuntu, like any other educational concept and education itself, we have to treat this notion as something in potentiality, not as an actualized practice. Because as soon as we treat it as something that has already been actualized, it can no longer be there. Because what potentiality does is to allow opportunities for more clarification, for more divergent understandings, for more plausible perspectives of the concept. So I would argue that the notion of Ubuntu cannot just be treated as other than something that has to remain in potentiality. Hence my emphasis on Ubuntu is a practice in becoming. And how does one do this? I think we would be naive if we want to associate Ubuntu with the attainment of a consensus. Because if we move towards the notion of a consensus, then we already undermine the possibility that things can be different, that there can be disagreement, that there can be dissonance, that there can be dissent. So Ubuntu, for me, cannot be a notion that has to strive towards the enactment of a consensus, because consensus in its very meaning implies that there cannot be any further space for elaboration. So I would rather be comfortable with the idea that Ubuntu is a practice that opens up our thinking towards dissent and dissonance and disagreement as well, in order for the engagement of people to be ongoing. I don't have more than that to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Youssef, Leslie, and Jose, for pushing our thinking further about all these issues. Now it's time for us to move into our breakout sessions, whereby in small groups we would like you to think about the questions that we have formulated based on these three thought-provoking contributions. Initially, was according to our program, we were to come back at 10:45. So we'll try to stick to that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's try to be back at 10:50 for the large group discussion. So Mary, you can take over and explain how we're going to function.
Okay, I've sent all of you a participants package that has the visual organizer, all of the notes from the synthesis, and these guiding questions. I've adjusted the groups just slightly because we have 24 together right now, so I've dropped it. Oh, there's Iveta has just joined in, so I'll pop her into one of the rooms as well. Welcome, Iveta. So we'll drop it down to 2 rooms. So there'll be 12 in each room. Just a slight adjustment for the moderators and rapporteurs. In breakout room 1, Marcial and Ronisha will co-moderate and Laura will be the rapporteur. And in breakout room 2, Nee will be the moderator and Yvette and Rebecca will do the synthesis. So again, just a reminder I sent out to all the moderators. We're going to ask everybody to try to address question F. The other 5 questions, maybe discuss them as a group or do a quick overview and see where the group would like to start. You will not get through all 6 of the questions, but decide which ones are sort of burning questions that you would like to take on first. About 15 minutes before the end, I'll just give you a nudge to remind you to try to get to question F. And about 5 minutes before the end, I'll just give you a reminder that we're just about ready to wrap up so the rapporteurs can put their notes together. And then they'll bring your key points emerging back into the main room that we can build on when we come back together. So in just a moment, I'll start your breakout rooms. Let me stop sharing that. And then I'll pop into your breakout rooms just to make sure everything's okay if you have any questions.
So for the rest of our time together, we want to allow the rapporteurs to sort of report back. And then the discussants, Andre and Chizoba will share with us comments that were inspired by everything they heard or the contributions they read. And then we'll open up for general discussion. So without further ado, I will turn to our rapporteurs. We have Laura and then Yvette, right?
Yvette and Rebecca are working together. So I'll stop sharing so that Laura can share her screen, and then she'll stop sharing, and Rebecca and Yvette can take over.
Okay, good.
All right, thank you everyone for the really fascinating discussion throughout. I'll be sharing notes from breakout room 1. And we focused on the question, what elements of curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, and policies should be included for education within a post-human Ubuntu framework? And what differences would we foresee if this was aimed at the elementary, secondary, or post-secondary level? And you can see that I took my own notes, so I won't read them word by word, but I'll try and highlight as I go down. So thank you. Just in transitioning from one to the other, I haven't been able to clean them up yet. Ronisha started us off by talking about the African Diaspora AP Capstone Seminar as a particular curriculum and pedagogy in place, in which students selected their own research questions and were able to make connections between their own cultural practices and Africa or their family's history in the African diaspora. And it was a process through which teachers were facilitators and helped students gain global competence and critical consciousness, but certainly pedagogically took teachers out of the role of, conveyor of content to the facilitator of skills. And Lynn shared ecologically oriented educational practices from Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island or North America, and just such as vision questing and going into the wilderness, and highlighted relational education and praxis, and questioned what the praxis is between home forms of education, or what types of these education don't fit in schools, and how schools can honor them and extend them. Thomas shared work in Norway focused on sustainable identity development, having students explore how they see themselves, how they wish to be seen, and how they experience being seen, which is ties in tightly with the idea of Ubuntu and being with people, and focused on starting early, before issues or concepts that would shut down a person's value or have a particular conception of Africa would be internalized, and focused on sustainable identity. Jose questioned the question about elements because Ubuntu focused on the philosophy and the relationships, and if, that particular pedagogies would come out of this philosophy of relating to each other's. And Ronisha inserted the question of humanizing education and cultural connectedness in response to Thomas's question about how Ubuntu deals with anti-Blackness. And then Yusuf and Jose took us back to this idea of Ubuntu as a universal, but not a universalist concept. And so that in a conception of Ubuntu that is relational, and is about the community and the individual in relationship versus one over the other, then it's beyond the constraints of prejudice. And so, it speaks back to those, negative or negating concepts, but goes beyond because it has a universal application. So I think that those were the pieces that I highlighted. I'll certainly open the floor to other folks, but it was a very engaging conversation in that connection between the underlying philosophy and then the pedagogies and practices that might result in different contexts.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, so we'll move on then to the second group, to Yvette.
Hello, everyone. I could share my screen if I remembered how to do that. I don't think it will let me share my screen at the moment.
Okay.
So I will just read from it, and then Rebecca and colleagues, if you would be kind enough to chip in where I have erred. Okay, we talked first of all about the question, what do we need as scholars and teachers to keep Ubuntu alive? And well, there were two main ways of approaching it. One way was, well, when did we decide that Ubuntu was under threat? And quite rightly, we talked about the fact that if Ubuntu is a kind of conceptualization of the self and integral to the being, then it's not under threat. We're here and we're okay. We'll survive this, people. We will get through it. So as long as we keep Ubuntu, as long as we are around, Ubuntu is around. And it's our job to then go to the second point, which is how do we ensure that we talk about it? How do we reflect it in our academic discourse? And really importantly, one colleague said, the praxis of Ubuntu means that it requires examination and practice it in our daily actions, in our daily lives. So first of all, we have Ubuntu not under threat. It's who we are and what we do. So how do we do that? Academically, we can do that in citation, in exploration, and also we can do that in our praxis. And then the other thing that came up towards the end of the discussion was a way of applying Ubuntu to Western concepts. So we were giving some very good examples, such as assessment in education. And I think it was Leslie who went through the Latin root, what it means to assessment means to sit beside. Well, that's perfect for Ubuntu because that's with. And if we go back to what was said, one of the introductory comments, it's about alongside, person to person, with person. And that came across very strongly. The other things that we talked about were the second question. We looked at the idea of individualism and technology. And when we discussed that, we considered what would be the conceptualization if we began on the basis that technology assists and brings people together, which is actually what Ubuntu is about. And we talked a little bit about that, and we talked about the narrative of individualism and challenging that. And we also then had a look at, well, what do we mean by technology? So the historians were saying, well, technology is just what is contemporary and what is useful for the age within which you're located. But we were also reminded that there are other technologies that are historical, that embody how we are and who we are, and we must not forget those technologies in transmitting information and ways of communication. So the drum and dance and so on. And then I think the final thing was about looking at what we currently have and making sure we build on that, and Ubuntu being something that builds on what we already have. And either that's in terms of traditional practice or technology or anything else. But I will now ask my colleagues to please make amends where I have faltered.
Thank you, Yvette. So any additions from the other members of that group?
I think this is Rebecca. I think Yvette covered everything, and just building on our, I mean, we came to the conclusion that okay, Ubuntu, when we think about technology, so building on what we already have and using and think about the historical perspective that, you know, technology is not something new. Technology has always been, it's just an instrument that we use to fasten the work, to perform a little bit better, you know, whatever we're doing. So when you think about Ubuntu now in the world of, you know, COVID-19, but also AI and everything else, is all about how do we use the principle, use the technology to achieve the principle. So the technology will not be an end in itself, but actually a tool that we use to achieve our goals. So that's, and thank you. It was definitely a great group, and we were like, we needed more time, but it can't happen though. So thanks.
Now I would like to turn the floor to our two discussants, that is Chizoba and Ndri. And I think the agreement is that Chizoba will go first to share with us her comments and reactions to all she's heard or read, and then Drew will come in.
Oh.
So Chizoba, are you?
Was that the plan?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So you can start.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I joined, unfortunately, I'm in a different time zone, so it's very early here, so I wasn't able to listen to most of the sessions. But I guess from what I heard from Laura and Yvette, and of course thinking about where we are now in the world with COVID-19 and all the unexpected turns and twists that we're faced with. So I guess I'm thinking to myself, what does Ubuntu, or what does Ubuntu mean in this day and age, and what should it mean for us, especially as we think through moving forward to a world that is more sustainable. So an issue that has come up for me, and I think has implications for all of us, are the diverse ways in which our society somehow erases some people, and our progress, or some people's progress, is dependent on the disappearance of other people. And I think this mirrors the colonial project in Africa. But then you think about the health workers, the grocery workers. These are people that, once there's a little discussion about increasing minimum wage, everybody is going haywire. But these are the people now that really have made it possible for all of us to be seated safely at home and really being able to have the meetings that we're having today. So for me, one of the things that Ubuntu means for me here is really what it means for me here, but I think more importantly, moving forward really, is how do we practicalize the concept of Ubuntu in our civic life? We're citizens of different countries. How do we engage in such a way that people are actually paid equitable wages? People are not, now it's mostly the vulnerable people that are dying, especially in Canada, for example. It's the vulnerable people that are dying, the people living in homes, people with a disability living in homes, unable to stay with their parents. So these are the people these are the least amongst us, essentially, and these are the people that are dying, and the people taking care of them, we've never spent time thinking about who is taking care of them. And, I just heard someone on TV talking about how the people in these homes don't get to have paid sick days. So I think what is very urgent about Ubuntu now is how do we make the concept of Ubuntu more real within our civic and political lives. And I think it nicely connects well with the discussion about technology and curricula, because I feel like rightly, as the second group said, technology is nothing new. People have always had technologies of different kinds, but unfortunately we only think of technology in terms of Zoom or in terms of, our cell phones. But people had, like my grandfather was a blacksmith, there's technologies that he was using to make the knives he was making. So I guess the question is, what does it mean for us to make technologies that enables us to communicate the right things, that enables us to be each other's keepers, right? That enables us to be able to ensure that, we're not so obsessed with having everything me. And then, of course, when I think of me, I think of Trump too. But so, what does Ubuntu mean? I think that for me, urgently, what does Ubuntu look like for us as, within our political and civic life? And I feel like at the very least, it speaks to, what we're going to do when we are out of our quarantine. Are we going to decide that we're going to, write to our MPs or, connect to our senators or lend our voices to discussions about increasing the wages and the living conditions of people that are taking care of the least amongst us? What kinds of, within our classrooms, I really like this Africa Diaspora Capstone project. I think a lot of these discussions about decolonization, Ubuntu, they just sometimes, I think in our normal life, these things feel like, you know, ideal, you know, lovely things to think about. They don't seem pragmatic. And I think the challenge for us as scholars is to really be able to explicate, you know, in what ways might we be able to create curricula? In what ways might we be able to create classroom experiences that enables young people, eager people, well-intended people to be able to find their own personal journeys towards explicating what Ubuntu looks like. And if Ubuntu is, I am because you are, it means that we need to share. It means that we need to make space for each other to thrive and flourish, regardless, in spite of our diverse differences. I think the core thing, really, the core takeaway for me, and I hope everyone can think about this, is what does Ubuntu look like from a practical standpoint? And what are some of the things we might want to do as soon as quarantine is over, as civic and political actors? For me, that is the most urgent thing. And this has ramifications, but for both international foreign policy, domestic foreign policy, and of course, you know, health policies as well, thinking about mental health issues, and really, you know, and the kids coming up. So I think for me, this is my key takeaway from it. I'm looking forward to hearing what other people have to say.
Thank you very much, Chizoba. I forgot to introduce Chizoba. Chizoba is a graduate of the University of Toronto, the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, and CEO and founding member of Unveiling Africa, which is a foundation. And also, she's our incoming chair. So starting next week after our business meeting, Chizoba will be leading the Africa Special Interests Group. And now I would like to turn the floor to Ndri.
Okay.
And just to mention that Ndri is at Cornell, a professor at the Africana Studies, in Africana Studies. And you will allow me also to say that Ndri is the person who really brought the concept of Ubuntu within CIES. She was president of CIES in 2015, organized the conference in Washington, DC, and the theme was about Ubuntu. And since then, the concept has been in use. And I remember one thing that Ndri did was to invite people from all over the world to react to the theme of, to the concept of Ubuntu. And that gets back to what Youssef was saying in our group, that it's a concept, it's a human concept that should, it's like a heritage of humanity, that people have words for that phenomenon, for that concept in every culture, and that we should be really trying or striving to rediscover this as something that belongs, that is shared by the human species, and a universal, like Laura said, universal concept, not universalist. And I think if we can rediscover that, and I'm even wondering if there has been any project after the work that was done in 2015 to really get people to think about that concept in their own cultures or communities. What are the words that are used to capture that spirit of togetherness, of interconnectedness, living with one another, making room for people to express themselves? I would be interested. Maybe Youssef will touch upon that. So now I will turn the floor to Ndri to make her comments, and then we'll open to large discussion.
Okay, thank you, Martial. And I would like to say that Youssef was our keynote speaker during that conference. And many of you, Jose, you contributed. And I want to thank everybody that this gathering here is an illustration of the Ubuntu. That is a collective undertaking that led us to be here. So there's no claim of one person having really organized. It's the collective contribution that made it possible to create this space. And I would like to mention the concerns about the definition of an equal positioning. I think John Mbiti resolved that issue. It's saying that my existence has a meaning or is possible only because of your existence. So by saying that, it is asserting our equality, because without us, you would not be. Without me or I, you would not be. So we are all equal. Our existence is collectively, mutually supporting, assertive of that reality. I would like to mention in the heuristic dimension or the notion of becoming, of moving, as Youssef mentioned, we may be also sometimes be so concerned about moving, rushing, that we don't take the time to acknowledge the importance of the temporality dimension. That is not only that the future that is fascinating, that is taking us, as Chizoba was reminding us of the period we're living in, there are always already discussion about how to do bigger, what had been done that had contributed to creating the problem. Martial and I were talking about it recently. And here I would like to go back to something that I have mentioned before in another setting. When the African-American first woman medical doctor who was an astronaut, she gave a talk, and in the Q&A, somebody asked, how did it feel to be in space? And she responded, we are all in space. You see, this, we think of planet Earth as so special. It's that stable place in the universe, but we're just one little planet in the whole universe. And we are not stable. As we speak, the Earth is spinning. So we are perpetually in movement. So how do we come up with this acknowledgement that we are just one little part of a bigger existential thing that is there, both in terms of our location in the universe as the planet, and also on that planet, our own little spaces that we occupy. And all the inequalities that have been created internally, these ideas of borders that came up with some historical processes, the post-Westphalian notion of border, all these borders that are being challenged by a little creature that we can't even see with our own eyes. We see this beautiful representation of the coronavirus. We can't even see it with our own eyes. We need to take the technologies that we're referring to in order to have a sense of its existence. So we can't even see it. The biggest militaristic tools, the atomic bomb, we cannot go and bomb that virus. So that should make us think of all these ideas that have been driving us, driving the so-called modernity. Modernity that doesn't pertain to one particular group is the interpretation of what it is. So what I've done here is to also refer us to really thinking of the temporality the dimension of the different times, the past, present, and future. So I'm going to use this for the few seconds perhaps that I have left. The Sankofa. Here again, is a term that is used in the Twi language, but the idea exists everywhere. The Sankofa is that we have the past, we have the present, and the future. And we must look back into the past in order to enrich ourselves or to learn from the experiences we have had, we have gone through, in order to have a better understanding of where we are, our moment of the time, what are the issues, what are the challenges, what are the lessons that can enrich us. And as I have mentioned in other contexts, what is often missed in the representation of the Sankofa is the egg in the beak of the bird. The egg represents that delicate future. So what do we do with our knowledge of the past? What that past has led us to be in, to be able to do, to be facing, in order to envision the future. So that's where the question of how do we use Ubuntu to participate, to assert our agency in redefining that future. Because the well-being of the society, if we have this idea of a mutual interdependence, well, you cannot squander the planet, because the consequences, we will all face those consequences, negative consequences. Therefore, we have the right, and in fact, responsibility, to contribute to using the lesson of the past to dissect the present, the challenges, and to participate in the redefinition of the future. So how do we use Ubuntu to redefine that future? We have the right to claim that our existence are really interdependent. And this virus, COVID-19, is telling us that. The borders that we imagine have absolutely no meaning. They, as I mentioned in joking, the virus doesn't respect visas, doesn't respect those the borders. So how do we think in terms of those borders? What kind of policies, both internally, if we're still functioning in terms of the nation state, but also globally, and thinking of our own continent, our own part of the world? How do we mention to our policymakers that they need to create a better living environment for our people? And that, in fact, in that interdependent notion, creating better healthcare facilities, perhaps one day they too might need those facilities, because today, contrary to the tradition of flying to North America or Europe, and more to India or other part of the world to get healthcare services, because ours are non-existent. Well, today, in the context of the coronavirus, you cannot fly anywhere. So this should make us think that this is a statement in this part of our historical process, that we are indeed interdependent, that our well-beings are interdependent, that if you are, I'm not well, you're not well. That's exactly what this virus is telling us. So how do we move forward? How do we use Ubuntu, not only as academics, but also as a participant, as in the society, in our communities, locally, as teachers, and as colleagues, and as members of the broader community. So these are some of the points. I have a few more, but I think my time is up. And so the dialectical, I want to finish by saying that the dialectical relation between theory and reality. Theory must capture what is going on in the reality. And the theorizing may also lead to better understanding, defining of policies, and social transformation. And so how do we live that? So these are some of the questions. Again, I wrote down a few more things, but I would like to leave it here so that in thinking of the future, what is our vision? Is it growth? Is the idea of catching up? Catching up what? What the essence of what we want to catch up? So these are some fundamental questions that as academics, as organic intellectuals, as members of communities, as family members, as citizens of this world, we can use Ubuntu to guide us in our social processes and our daily life as part of our humble contributions. So I would like to stop here. And sorry if I took maybe a few more minutes.
Don't worry, Andre. This was really fascinating, and you raised some deep and fundamental questions that at least got me thinking, and I'm sure the other participants also. Normally we have 5 minutes left, but if people, I mean, have some flexibility, we can take about 10 minutes to open up for discussion. And I would like to give each of our contributors 1 minute at the end of the large group discussion, just to share some final thoughts with us. So now the floor is open for the next 10 minutes for other people to jump in and contribute, raise questions, make comments, or share information. So you can just raise your hand. Luis?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for the very stimulating conversation. So when I joined the breakout session the other time, I was introducing myself as a young scholar. And I'm originally from Nigeria, and of course my first degree was from there, but I'm currently doing a master's in the UK. And I just want to say that I've really enjoyed being a part of the session, and I really want to commend Andre's energy in communicating what she was talking about, because if truly we want to promote something like this, it needs to come with the kind of energy that we invest into it. However, I have had an experience, and I feel that it might be a challenge in the long run, because see, it's important that we also know how the amount of readiness that people working in, I'm talking from Africans in Africa, and I'm talking of Africa itself, the readiness of institutions, of researchers, of teachers, of school owners within Africa to things like this at different levels. And I'll give an example of what we did recently. So I run a social enterprise that works with universities, and we got a partnership that offers African universities 20 free access to online learning through videos and all that. And we've been promoting for many, many weeks. We've only had 2 universities reach out to us, only 2. And this is not the first time, because there's been times that we've promoted things like this. The problem is, how ready are these institutions to actually promote things like this within Africa itself? And generally, I mean, I had worked in the university in Nigeria before for many years, and I can tell you for a fact, there's still so much of, I don't know what word to use, schools are very laid back in so many areas in receiving or responding to issues. Sometimes, most of the time we say that Africans or African institutions or governments don't prepare ahead. There isn't so much of proactiveness in terms of preparing ahead. But even when we need to react sometimes very fast. And that is what we should learn from this COVID-19 experience. I studied in a university in the UK, and the kind of—
May I ask you to
round up?
Yes.
Yes. So I just worry about what's going to be the reception within Africa itself to this. And especially considering the fact that Ubuntu is not a familiar term in many aspects, in many parts of Africa. It might, cause some, just my thoughts, really.
Yeah. Well, I would like to thank you, Louis. Maybe Youssef, you want to maybe talk about that?
If the concern is that Ubuntu might not manifest in Africa, then the question should be posed, what conditions will have to be in place for Ubuntu to be cultivated? And I think it is as important to focus on the conditions that have to be in place in the cultivation of Ubuntu and the actualization of Ubuntu in itself. So that's my first point. The second point would be to say, if Ubuntu is considered as inherent to humans, to what makes us human beings, then there is an understanding that Ubuntu is already there and it doesn't have to be recreated. So the next question would then be, then what do you do? I think what has happened in the silencing of Ubuntu, if I may say so, was that Ubuntu was not perhaps as clearly articulated in the languages of cultures and communities. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't necessarily mean because Ubuntu has not been communicated incessantly through language that it wasn't there. And that would mean that we have to invoke the concept of Ubuntu through our languages. In fact, what we're doing now is not a reification of Ubuntu, but rather a re-articulation of Ubuntu in a language that we share. So I think what can be done, if the concept were to manifest more ubiquitously, more pervasively on the continent or certain parts of the continent, is to make it part of the language that you speak. And here I don't use language in the sense of a linguistic term, but it has to become part of your discourses, your argumentations, your forms of living. And in that way, it invariably manifests. So
thank you, Youssef. Okay. Yeah, thank you. I haven't seen any other hands up. As I don't see any other hands up, I would like to allow our contributors, Leslie and Jose, and maybe come back to Youssef if he has anything to add. So Leslie, you have the floor for 1 minute final comments.
The only thing I want to say is, I want to say thank you. I was able to be part of the conversation, so I've been enriched by the conversation, and my understanding of Ubuntu has been enriched. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. Jose?
That was very brief, Leslie. But anyway, I wanted to say, point to a few things here that I said earlier, and hopefully I can squeeze that in 1 minute, which, essentially the Cosmo-Ubuntu orientation that needs to, that I want to remind us of here is that it's this voluntary embracing of Ubuntu. So there's no forcing anyone to embrace it as a foundational value system in our participation in this planetary conviviality. And in this particular system, then there's personhood applies to all humans, and we've articulated that in our group as well, Yusuf and I, and precludes this individuation, classification, and hierarchies. So part of the problem is when that isn't understood, and it's also an African-derived concept. So part of that is the misunderstanding of this, and then trying to fit it into the this new paradigm, the paradigm that we used to. And so just to caution folk that as we move forward, we continue to be critical about how we are using or applying this particular concept. We be careful that it doesn't become patronized and it doesn't become appropriated and so on, in order for us to foster what it wants to foster, which is justice, and equity around the world. So just to stop there. There's so much more about New Theorizing I wanted to say, but I think this is good enough.
Yeah, we'll have more opportunities to engage. I mean, it's a conversation that is that's been going on since 2015, and it will keep on. So, Yusuf?
All that's left for me is to say thank you for the Bantaba. And thank you for meeting you.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. I don't have much to add, but to say that this has been a very engaging conversation, and I would like to share with you in closing two quotes that have caught my attention. In the piece by Leslie, one idea, that quote from Braidotti, that in the absence of humans, life will go on. To me, I mean, it really has made me reflect a lot about our current situation. I mean, for so long we have come to think that we are sort of the sacred species. And I'm quoting from Hubert Reeves, who is an astrophysicist from Quebec in Canada. He says that humanity is not necessarily nature's favorite, that humanity may very well disappear, and that we are not a sacred species. We are not this chosen species, as we have believed for a long time, and that nature can very well do without us. And it will not eliminate us. It is we who could eliminate ourselves. And if we do eliminate ourselves, nature will not particularly mourn, but it will continue to develop other species, hoping that these species will be better able to preserve themselves and not to destroy themselves. So it's sort of destabilizing, but it's the sad reality that we are facing. And I think from, looking forward, Chizoba was asking, what can we do after this, the coronavirus pandemic? I think as educators, we do have a role to play in getting people to think seriously about this possibility that we may disappear, like 9 million animal species before us have disappeared. So to me, it brings a sense of humility that we must live by. And like Dre said, our planet is just a tiny little dust in the whole universe. And it's hard to accept, but that's where I think the future lies for us in realizing this possibility that we could disappear as a species. So with those notes, I would like to call upon Jose to change hats as our chair to close this session. But before that, I would like to remind you all or inform you all that we have 2 other activities coming. We have our business meeting next Tuesday from 11 to 12:30. And we'll end our participation in CIES on April 30 with a plenary session with Joe Samoff, who is among us today, on fixing foreign aid. That will be on April 30, starting at 1 p.m. So with that, Jose, can you help us?
Thank you. Yeah, do you mind passing to the next slide so I can
yes,
not leave anybody out? But first and foremost, I would like to thank everyone who participated. You know, you made time, some of you probably very, very early in the morning. And so thank you for coming to be a part of this. And it was a very stimulating conversation, as we've been seeing in the chats and the conversations and people just saying this in the interventions. Joel is actually with us here. So, you know, he's gonna be presenting that. We're looking forward to his presentation and discussion. So we invite you all to join us, as Marcial has already pointed out. Thank you, Marcial, very much. You know, for all the energy, for keeping us, you know, together as a team on our toes and reminding us of deadlines and things that we needed to do. So thank you for chairing this session. Thank you to Mary, Ronisha for moderating. Thank you very much, Nii, you know, for also joining that room, the moderators. I mean, this work wasn't easy, you know, Mary, Ronisha, and Marcial, and Yvette, Rebecca, and Laura. The work that you did wasn't easy. Having to read all these papers, having to think through what to say, having to listen to conversations and summarize. I mean, that's really, really complex work. And I commend you for all of that. We commend you as the Africa SIG. Ndri and Chizoba, very grateful that you also were able to capture, you know, what we talked about and pushed us into these territories, these places of thinking about theory and practice and the actuality of, you know, and especially the spatial temporal aspects. Thank you for all that. We also, as Africa SIG, are very grateful that Leslie and Youssef agreed to be a part of this discussion. And, you know, we couldn't have imagined what the synergy that would have been generated from these conversations. And I am really delighted that I was a part of this. I feel privileged to have been a part of this trio, and we could engage and provide one another with perspectives on a concept and a philosophy, a way of life that is so dear to us, and provide that paradigm, you know, beyond the you know, just an intellectual exercise. I think this is a challenge to adopting a lifestyle, basically, a whole new way of looking and living, you know, life, looking at life and living life. So thank you very much, you know, for all of this. I believe I mentioned everybody's name here, and if I missed anyone, please accept my apologies. But thanks, and thank you. We also saw here our president, Yvette, was here, so we want to acknowledge her being here as well, and all the friends and colleagues. Keep collaborating with us. We would like to have you continue engaging with us. Thank you, and see you at the business meeting, some of you, and others at Joel's session. Thank you.